Welcome everyone. This is the very first webinar for the Alternatives Project, or TAP. And my name is Frank Adamson, and I'm an assistant professor at California State University in Sacramento. And to get us started, please use the chat box to introduce yourself with your name, country, and your title or role. This is TAP's first webinar. This is our launch. So if things don't go smoothly, please have patience. And we will offer the initial hour in 4 languages: English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. However, our translators are TAP members and not professional translators and have written versions of our remarks to help them. If we have to deviate from those remarks for some reason, please have patience with the translation. Our translators are Sylvain Aubry in French, Maria Rambalsera in Spanish, and Gustavo Fishman in Portuguese. For those using the interpretations, you can mute the English voice in the toolbar. So, I'm gonna go back a slide. Our general housekeeping, the webinar details are that we invite all participants to add their preferred language first to their name on Zoom. So for example, my name says English-Frank Adamson. This helps us assist with sorting into language-specific breakout rooms. We have muted participants to reduce the feedback, but please use the chat box for any questions or comments. Participants can change between seeing only the speaker or seeing everyone in gallery view at the upper right of the Zoom screen. And we'll have time for discussion and questions and answers at the end. And finally, TAP wants to say a special thank you to Education International for providing this space and to Gabriel Castro for hosting and assisting. Oh, our agenda consists of 5 main activities. First, we will hear an introduction of the Alternatives Project by Steve Cleese. Then we will hear the TAP statement in 4 languages. Third, we will have a brief panel with 4 discussants. We will then move into breakout rooms for smaller group conversations so that you can provide input. And finally, we will conclude with a plenary discussion conducted in English without simultaneous translation. So, without further ado, Steve.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Cleese. I'm a political economist concerned with education and international development, although development is a very problematic term, as we all know. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland in the US, but in addition to teaching and research, I view activism as a very important part of my work and my life. So welcome first to this wonderful World Social Forum. I've been to the World Social Forum twice before, and each time it was a very amazing and energizing experience, as I am sure this virtual one will be as well. And welcome to our session on our new organization, the Alternatives Project, or known by its initials as TAP. TAP is an international and geographically diverse network of progressive academics, union members, civil society activists, and social movement participants concerned with building a collective global critical voice oriented towards education and societal transformation. At the moment, we have 20 core members, but are looking to expand that group. As TAP's first activity, we developed a sign-on statement in English that has been translated into Arabic, Chinese, French, Hindi, Kiswahili, Korean, Portuguese, and Spanish, with more languages on the way. We started with an initial invited signature list of about 125 people from around the world, including, I'm happy to say, Noam Chomsky. The statement entitled Education Justice for Societal Transformation details the issues our societies currently face and their intersections with the social, climate, economic, and political justice that education justice demands. After I finish talking, we will spend about 15 minutes reading the statement. After this session, go to our website, which will be posted in the chat, to read it and sign. You can also contact us via the website to get more involved in TAP. We seek to contribute to building a movement that will offer a collective challenge to dominant ideas and policies on education and development through grassroots struggles and campaigns. We envision a long-term effort to build and promote a new vision of alternative approaches to help be a clearinghouse for progressive analysis and alternative ideas that is linked to a wide range of progressive and radical organizations and movements that will become a force for equitable learning opportunities and outcomes, democracy, and economic and social justice in a more sustainable world. More specifically, our objectives are to provide a place for the enhancement of this collective critical global voice for education and social transformation, to develop an international network of progressive academics, activists, practitioners, and youth committed to education and social justice, to connect our education network with other progressive education movements, as well as with groups concerned with social transformation, and to advocate for and build campaigns around creating alternative progressive approaches to education. The creation and dissemination of our sign-on statement was a first step, intended to show the world that there are many, many people who have fundamental concerns about the current directions of our education, economic, and political systems, and to bring together many of these like-minded individuals into a network concerned with moving the world forward. We cannot win these demands without struggle, coalition building, without concerted and coordinated action at the grassroots and international levels. We must educate, organize, and agitate. We now turn to reading our statement. This will be followed by a panel of TAP members making very short presentations, after which we will try to have some small group discussions. Right now, the reading of our statement in English will be shared by 3 TAP members: Antonia Wolf of Education International, followed by Salim Valley of the University of Johannesburg, concluding with Frank Adamson of California State University in Sacramento. In other languages, it will be read by our wonderful interpreters. Take it away, Antonia.
The Alternatives Project Statement. Education Justice for Societal Transformation, a Framework for Action. We, the undersigned, believe that current social, economic, political, and educational arrangements reproduce relations of power that engineer profound inequities and will ultimately threaten life on the planet. We stand for alternative pedagogies and for just, regenerative education systems that will support the social transformations we need in order to create a richer, more equitable, and sustainable world. Coexisting and interrelated global crises are pushing humanity and the living planet towards political, social, economic, and ecological collapse. These crises, currently seen in the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, structural inequalities, police brutality and racism, entrenched patriarchy, accelerating climate chaos, and the constant threat of wars. are driven globally by capitalism and militarism. We must seize this unique historical moment to reconceive and radically change public education as an entry point for deeper transformations that will build human solidarity and cooperation and bring an end to racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. We reject the notion that education's priority is to build human capital. We assert that education's priority should include regenerative ecosystems and further social justice for current and future generations. This requires the creation of just education systems, which we can only achieve as part of a broader struggle for social transformation in all other spheres, especially the economy and in politics. Progressive struggles are necessary to form new social contracts that serve the collective interests of the many rather than the self-interests of the few. Human history reflects a series of complex and interlinked social transitions shaped by power relations. From agrarianism to industrialization, through colonial conquest, authoritarian dictatorships, post-colonialism, neoliberal globalization, and the digital revolutions and collusion between surveillance capitalism and the national security state we see today. Each new dominant class produces an ideology that perpetuates its domination, justifies the inequalities it invariably creates, and fosters pessimism that change is possible at all. These ideological hegemonies almost always involve adherence to and create education systems that reinforce hierarchical assumptions and rigid binary conceptions, human, non-human, male, female, mind, body, secular, spiritual, superior, inferior, urban, rural, us, them, that assume the right of conquest and to exploit the natural world and all living species. The contemporary authoritarian, nativist, patriarchal, and settler colonial populisms emerging worldwide in the wake of globalization and the increased migrations due to conflict and climate change sharpen these binary oppositions and provoke social insecurities to tighten their grip. Today, education systems around the world are forged in the mindset of neoliberal capitalism and ideas of efficiency, rate of return, choice, competition, and economic growth. This ideology affords wealthy supranational corporations and billionaires unbridled power to reshape the global economy and national political systems, perpetuating extractive carbon-based economic activity and resulting in unconstrained consumption and the critical degradation of ecosystems. Organized in this way, education systems serve to reinforce and legitimize social inequality, segregation, and stratification within and across nations. Yet, as much as it reflects prevailing hegemonies, education is also a pivotal site of contestation. Authoritarian states, knowing full well that education can be a force for transformation, move swiftly to wield it as a tool for ensuring compliance and control.
Thanks, Antonia. Consequently, for many children and young people, this world is bleak. The quality of education that they receive is increasingly segmented by the socioeconomic status and geographic location of their families. Education is increasingly organized in competitive markets that create and entrench race, class, and gender inequities where private providers and contractors, as well as teachers and students, compete by and are ranked on cost efficiency and standardized tests. A commodified education model delivered via constrained public budgets, focusing on outcome benchmarks, human capital formations, and economic rate of return and value for money. This model reinforces human exceptionalism, racial prejudice, and white supremacy, denigration of difference, legitimation of economic and political inequalities, hyper-individualism, unbridled economic growth, and uncritical reception of advertising rhetoric, and compliance with authoritarian rule. One consequence is the bizarre contradiction that the most widely educated population in human history is collectively triggering the eco-collapse of the living planet's systems, an act of collective suicide and ecocide. Over the last 30 years, sustained advocacy by civil society and education unions moved the world to embrace the right to education and the aspiration of education for all. Compulsory schooling has expanded to unprecedented levels of scale, engaging nearly 2 billion children each day. Most families now assume that completing 8 to 12 years of schooling is essential for the future of their children, and most governments assume that providing free public education to all children and youth is sound public policy. But we are nowhere near achieving this. In part, wider structural injustices caused by the past 4 decades of market fundamentalism have driven sustained social sector underspending and disparaged all government activity as ineffectual and wasteful. Consequently, the financing of education has been woefully inadequate, and much more funding is required and is possible from national governments as well as bilateral and multilateral international organizations. It is not that there is no money. Governments always find money to spend on the military, the police, security, and surveillance, and corporate welfare. To confront this ideology, we must expose scarcity as a myth and austerity as a deliberate policy choice to drive the agenda for neoliberal privatization. While spending targets on education reflect a global consensus, most governments do not even meet the target of spending 20% of their budgets and 6% of their GDP on education. The international community has promised for decades to spend 0.7% of their GDP on official development assistance, yet allocates only a fraction of this. And all of these targets greatly underestimate the need. We need to win these arguments in the public sphere. The problem goes beyond funding. International financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank are neo-colonial institutions promoting neoliberal so-called Washington consensus policies throughout the world. The IMF and the World Bank have had a major role in influencing education and other social policy. Instead of supporting education, the IMF actually restricts country spending on hiring teachers and other public sector workers. The World Bank pretends to be a research-based source of objective advice, but for the last 4 decades has based its recommendations on its neoliberal ideology. It is high time for a new Bretton Woods conference to consider a major overhaul of the IMF and the bank. We call for radical change. All governments must establish free public education from early childhood through higher education that will enable a critical, participatory, democratic re-evaluation of how we think and act together in the world. To deliver education as a human right requires fully funded public systems, sustainably financed through national and global progressive redistributive tax systems, with unconditional assistance from the international community. The curriculum should actively reject the docile consumer complicity that feeds global warming and climate catastrophe. Rooted in the community, education must be culturally relevant and promote humanistic values of anti-racism, anti-sexism, solidarity, social cohesion, empathy, imagination, creativity, personal fulfillment, peace, eco-minded stewardship, and strengthening of democracy. Teachers need professional autonomy, quality working conditions, and through unions and other organizations, a major voice in policymaking. Likewise, students and their representative organizations must also have a voice in political and pedagogical decision-making, having their right to participation fully acknowledged. I now turn over to Professor Frank Adamson.
Thank you, Salim. The world needs a radical revisioning of education that will help to transform and create regenerative societies. This will require a new social contract that values social spending above military and security spending and goes beyond the narrow interests of the business sector, ed tech firms, private school chains, and other edu-business actors. We call for reversing the movement towards the privatization of education and other social services and keeping business logic out of education and social policy. We instead draw on struggles and lessons from organized students and teachers, the trade union movement as a whole, democratic community-based organizations, including associations of minorities, migrants, and refugees, as well as independent media, organizations, and professionals that share our commitment to advancing justice in the flawed, real societies in which we live. These groups have already developed alternatives for educational justice, including schools and non-formal education programs that support 21st century socialist, indigenous, and Black sovereignty, decolonialism, Black Lives Matter, abolitionist, and critical pedagogies. Justice in education depends on advancing justice-related goals in 4 areas: social justice, building education for equity, transformation, and regenerative living. Education systems need to reorient towards addressing the inequalities and injustices in their societies, fostering racial, gender, and disability justice and models of inclusion that will teach how to work collectively and drive the transformation of education and society. Number 2, climate justice, learning how we can live regeneratively on the planet. We need a global Green New Deal and public education systems that teach human ecology and stewardship values that will facilitate this transformation both now and in the future. Number 3, economic justice, financing education and other public services in a transformed economy. The economic system must satisfy the real needs of all people by focusing on equity and opportunity, not profit. This pandemic must mark a fundamental shift away from capitalism and towards workplace democracy and a radically redistributive economy that prioritizes progressive tax and progressive spending on public services for all, nationally and globally. Number 4, political justice, reframing political engagement at all levels. We need to move away from the authoritarianism and xenophobic nationalism. We must energize global solidarity, cultivate international cooperation, and strengthen global intersectional grassroots movements. We need to develop more inclusion and participatory democracies at local, national, and global levels. These initial ideas do not point to a distant utopian mirage. Rather, they build upon the thoughts and actions of many progressive groups and organizations around the world. We, the undersigned, see these ideas for a radical re-envisioning of education and society as necessary directions to counter and overcome the severe crises the planet is facing. I believe it is time for our speakers, and our first speaker will be Sangeeta. Sangeeta, you're muted.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Frank. I'm just going to be presenting a few thoughts on sort of what the goals and vision of TAP are. And I think a lot of it is really there in the statement, I think elaborated, I think very eloquently. But just to put forward some thoughts and some sort of specifics about sort of what led us to create this network and the kind of the way in which we see it evolve. I'm Sangeeta Kamath, Professor of Education at the University of Massachusetts and a member of the Alternatives Project, TAP, right? And there are several reasons why many of us from academic and civil society organizations believe a network like TAP is vital to expand and amplify the many efforts, initiatives, and struggles in education that seek to build a more just, equitable, and fair world. Many of these initiatives and struggles remain local or may at times become national, but rarely do education struggles acquire a global or international presence. I think, in some ways one can see the UN SDGs like the Sustainable Development Goals, and for educators, the SDG 4 in particular, that is about providing equitable and inclusive quality education for all, as an effort to raise education issues to a global level. These are laudable goals, though they remain nothing but aspirational goals on paper, without a people's movement that puts pressure on the UN, on governments, and mobilizes international opinion towards it. TAP aims to be part of such international mobilization and awareness building by showcasing struggles, resistances, and social movement-based alternatives in different parts of the world. Just this summer, we saw how the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis led to unprecedented international solidarity for Black Lives Matter around the world. In India, where I'm from, Black Lives Matter became Dalit Lives Matter, and Black, Dalit, and Indigenous rights became linked in a single call for abolition politics and reparations. And I think this is a moment in history, that's a very unique moment in history where three crises are concurrent and convergent. The crisis of capitalism, the crisis of democracy, and the climate crisis. Capitalist crisis that manifests as grotesque inequality, the 99% versus the 1%. The crisis of democracy that we see in the rise of authoritarian populism and white supremacy in so many parts of the world. I would just name India, Brazil, and the US, but there are so many more. And the climate crisis that school children have, that it's, and we have to really, I think about this, that it's school children that have forced world leaders to reckon with the climate crisis, something that ought to humble us as educators and scientists. Future generations are going to ask us, where were you? What were you doing in the midst of a planetary crisis? What kinds of collectives and organizations did we build or join or work with in order to build a new, that could be the basis for a more just and sustainable world? I believe this is a historic moment that calls on us to play however modest a part to not only roll back the disaster that is neoliberal capitalism, but to forge alternatives and offer our support and solidarity to those that are resisting and challenging the status quo and putting forward an imaginary of a radically different future in the process, hence the Alternatives Project. My own learning has come from social movements and grassroots organizations and activists in India who have inspired and instructed me that indeed there are alternatives and we must work and labor to make them true. I believe those of us who participate in the WSF understand this all too well. My commitment, therefore, and that of TAP, is to strengthen social movements and offer solidarity and support that leverages a broad-based alliance among activists and academics. And these are the kinds of alliances that I think we've seen have been successively sort of undermine the alliance between activists and the academy. That have been undermined by decades of neoliberalism, which depoliticizes everything and encourages individualism. And this is something we must resist and overcome to build robust alliances. TAP's project is to build a network of scholar activists, union leaders, and allied organizations, along with grassroots organizations and progressive civil society organizations around the world to support campaigns for educational justice and highlight radical alternatives that resist neoliberalism and deepen democratic socialism. Some examples of this may be to build an internet database of such struggles that are occurring in different parts of the world, forging conversations and dialogues among activists from different continents to share struggles and strategize, participating in campaigns for international advocacy, and much more. So this is just a brief vision of what TAP's potential is, that many of us who are part of sort of the initial sort of group that formed TAP, and I think this is kind of the vision that sort of drove us to form this, and I hope that you will join and you will be part of this. I'm going to end here and pass the mic to my comrade, Salim Valley.
Thanks, Sangeeta. I'm back. As you've heard, my name is Salim Valley, and I am South Africa's National Research Foundation's Chair in Community, Adult and Workers' Education, and the Director of the Center for Education Rights and Transformation, which is based at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. So my abiding interest has been to combine academic research with social intervention and to create synergy between socially engaged scholarship and community concerns and needs. And this critical praxis, flowing from Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, is embodied in the leitmotif of our center, reading the word and the world, changing the text and the context. And South Africa has a proud legacy of resistance against our erstwhile apartheid education system. And this resistance generated various popular epistemologies, pedagogies. We've had the People's Education Movement, worker education, popular adult and community education, and education with production. And these pedagogies, grounded in the lived experiences of the oppressed and linked to mass democratic and grassroots organizations, captured the imagination of thousands of South Africans and really unleashed tremendous creative energies during the struggle against apartheid. The education initiatives we had promised liberation from an authoritarian, unequal, racist, and sexist education system to one which could provide an alternative basis for a future democratic and egalitarian one. Although the apartheid state banned Freire's books, hundreds of copied versions of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed were clandestinely distributed at Black universities and eagerly studied by the young activists of the Black consciousness movement, including Steve Biko, who, by the way, was tortured and murdered by the security police a mere few weeks after attending a course on Frere's methods, which were then used in a number of community initiatives. And students in that period and others applied Frere's ideas to many other literacy and conscientization projects in urban townships and some rural areas. And really the appeal of Frere's pedagogy to activists partly resided in the fact that Frere's anti-capitalist worldview accorded with the insights at which the liberation movement in South Africa in general and educationists active in it arrived at. But the nature of the negotiated settlement between the apartheid regime and the liberation movement meant that a liberal democratic dispensation was attained, but not radical change. Close to 3 decades since the first democratic elections in South Africa, the combined weight of apartheid's legacy, exacerbated by neoliberal policies, has resulted in South Africa becoming the most unequal country in the world. And while a melange of new official policies on every conceivable aspect of education exists, and racially based laws have been removed from the statutes, the education system as a whole reflects and reproduces the wider inequalities in society, and quality education remains elusive. And although a minority of schools in South Africa can favorably compare with the best in the world, quality education remains unequally distributed along social class, racial, and spatial lines. The consequences of the neglect of public education and the privatization and commodification is the privatization and the commodification of education. This situation exists not only in primary and secondary schools, but also in early childhood development, adult and community education, and in higher education. Frustrations, as many people know, in higher education resulted in the fees must fall movement. So really the alternative project, TAP, speaks to our own history of alternatives and a broader understanding of education for social justice, which we abandoned in favor of a banal instrumentalism and its narrow human capital notions. While we should, in the words of the great African intellectual and revolutionary Amilcar Cabral, return to the source of our own alternatives developed in the course of struggle, we do understand that neoliberalism is a global movement, and the TAP initiative allows us to crucially strategize, enrich, and engage in solidarity across borders, as Sangeeta has explained. And finally, an unjust world is not inevitable. We are often accosted with the demand to produce a viable or realistic alternative, or scolded with an emphatic Tina, there is no alternative. That argument, we are accustomed to it. The riposte to this is Temba. There must be an alternative. In our Nguni languages, Temba also means hope. Or as Professor Stephen Cleese maintains, tapas, there are plenty of alternatives. Thank you. I now turn the floor over to David Archer.
Thank you very much, Salim. And so I'm David Archer. I'm the head of public services with the International NGO ActionAid. And I'm also the chair of the Right to Education Initiative and a co-founder of the Global Campaign for Education. I always prefer just to speak spontaneously, but we were encouraged to write something down on this occasion to help the translators. Some of what I say echoes strongly what Salim has been saying, because my lifelong inspiration has also been the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who perhaps most fundamentally argued that education is never neutral. Education is always political. There's always a choice in every system, in every classroom, in every moment, a choice between an education that is domesticating or an education that is liberating, a choice between students being passive recipients of knowledge from supposedly an all-knowing teacher, or students and teachers being active subjects working together in a process of critical dialogue with the world that links reflection and transformative action. When I was training as a teacher in the 1980s, in the UK, I wrote a thesis on the relevance of Paulo Freire's work for the UK education system, which was at the time being somewhat trampled and undermined by Margaret Thatcher and the ideology of Thatcherism, that really the origins of neoliberalism. I then spent 5 years working on popular education programs in Latin America, inspired by Freire, and I wrote a book about literacy and power with case studies from 8 different countries, looking at how those ideas have been used in different contexts by, for example, the revolutionary Sandinista government in Nicaragua, the original Sandinistas, not what's going on now, the guerrilla movements in El Salvador and Guatemala, and by the progressive forces that were resisting Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile and several other countries. And out of that, during the 1990s, I developed this reflect approach to adult learning, very much named after Freire, inspired by him, and that as an approach spread like wildfire across over 70 countries. And I had the privilege of corresponding with Paulo Freire, meeting him several times up until he passed away in 1997. I'm always incredibly wary about individualizing anything, but for me, Paulo Freire was absolutely, was and is my guru, the person who I see guiding every stage of my work. And he certainly continues to underpin, I think, everything that I do over the last 2 decades, working to popularize the right to education at a community level, supporting the development of national, regional, and global coalitions on education. In one way or another, the core challenge in any of this work is always about creating democratic spaces where people can have a sustained dialogue that links reflecting, evidence building, and action in a constant cycle. Whether it's about people mobilizing to have a sustained dialogue with governments about education reform, or challenging the concentration of power in the hands of international donors like the World Bank or the IMF. In one way or another, creating that democratic space and a cycle of critical dialogue remains the same. There is in every classroom a complex intersectional power dynamic, and it's happening in every classroom, in every working space, and in every advocacy encounter that you can be involved in. And unless we actively recognize this and work actively to transform power, we can easily do a lot more harm than good. Sustainable change is fundamentally about shifting power. The alternative vision of education that's captured in this collective statement, in the alternatives project as a whole, is one that resonates with everything that Paulo Freire stood for. It connects with the struggle for equity and justice within education with the struggle for equity and justice in the world. And in this moment, with the disruptions of COVID, the rise of new fascisms and the urgency of the climate crisis, there's never been a better time to build a movement that calls for public education systems that properly contribute to transforming our economies and our societies. There's no doubt that education based on a domesticating banking model can be an incredibly powerful weapon in the hands of any oppressor. But we can also use transformative education as the most powerful equalizing and liberating force. And I think what we are sharing today offers a very clear path towards that much more positive vision. I shall now hand the word on to Carol-Ann Spreen. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, David. And thanks, it's so wonderful to see so many names from the past and to have so many people here joining us. I'm Carol-Ann Spreen. I'm a professor at New York University. And I started my professional education journey as a bilingual kindergarten teacher in a newcomer Latinx community on Chicago's West Side. My classroom was a converted storage room, and I had no books, no desks, no paper, no crayons. And I was responsible for nearly 40 5-year-olds for 7 hours a day with no resources. And I barely spoke Spanish. So as a new teacher with no experience, no resources, and little support, I was made deeply aware of the vast inequalities that exist in education, even in major US cities like Chicago. So for 25 years, I worked with teacher union organizations and progressive organizations and reform movements, partnering with public schools and universities to address issues of educational inequality, equity, and diversity, and to promote quality learning for all kids. I've been in hundreds of schools in and out of the US, and I've seen some wonderful and amazing things. But in far too many places, I've seen children who are disengaged and uninspired, and teachers who are stressed out and undermined, and no one taking responsibility or even having a vision to change things. For the vast majority of children, even those who do well in school, their education is dull and irrelevant and disconnected from the real world, divorced from their own experiences, culture, language, and what they know to be true. And while for years, progressive educators have tried to deepen and expand on the good ideas and examples of schools and organizations that are there that excite and inspire teachers, like we've heard from Paulo Freire and others, the ideas that really grab us. But yet so many governments have lacked the political will to invest in or take risks on radical reform. And most education leaders have lacked the courage and imagination to radically change things. So for me, the central question has been, how can we reimagine education? And how do we make public schools places where children thrive and where teachers are motivated and inspired to engage with the world? An essential dimension of the learning process is critical thinking, and thinking and learning how to question things and imagine the possibility of something different. This is the very essence of education. Many educators and activists have already begun to critically engage with the world and economic and political challenges that we face, like the growing authoritarianism, anti-democratic practices, individualist and neoliberal frames of learning and being, implications of all forms of discrimination and bigotry, race, gender, culture, religious class, the glowing global ecological crisis, through movement building and organizations. The current COVID pandemic has amplified these many dysfunctionalities and motivated many more of us to come together to try to question the way things are and do something about it. I believe that movements like TAP can be an essential space for producing new knowledge, change, and creating new possibilities. Coming together will enable us to discuss a variety of ideas for moving forward into a new social imaginary. Movements like TAP can create powerful tools for reshaping global social relations. It can also be an important force for changing and reimagining formal education. Our current system is focused on reforms on building structures that rely too heavily on standardized, test-driven accountability or technologies that dramatically constrain how we think about schooling or how we can imagine and transform learning. As activists and scholars of education who participate in many struggles for change, we hope to connect with youth organizations and other communities who are dissatisfied with the inadequate structures and institutions that organize the state of the world and are seeking ways to change it. It's also within these spaces that TAP can organize against and resist extreme market fundamentalism, authoritarianism, racism, and other evils through building relationships and alliances to create real alternatives. Through TAP, we seek to build a better future by advancing the education, health, and well-being of people and communities around the world. It's this abiding spirit and energy of our community that we do work together, and that sets this change in motion. So I look forward to discussing ways that we can connect and collaborate with all of you here. I'm going to turn our session over to Mark to move us.
Welcome back, everybody. We'll wait to see if there are still some people in the breakout rooms, but I think everybody has come back now. We'll start in just 1 minute. We have 8 breakout room group discussions to report on, 5 in English and 1 each in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I am proposing that we kind of weave the languages in that. And we're going to start with the English AD and then move to Spanish and kind of weave back and forth. I'll call on them. And I've got my stopwatch here on my phone to let people know when they're approaching the 1 minute that we've allocated for each of these reports. That's why we were so encouraging to use the Google Docs to include much more detailed information than you can report. But once again, thank everybody for joining us for this session and look forward to working with you.
Anne-Marie Kadur, who's going to be responding on this one from English A to D.
Okay, so let's turn then to our first report from the English A to D group.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. We had a great conversation in our group. And I just also want to say hi to Caroline and Hala, my very good friends who are here. So we really started by looking at this movement of movement of coalition that we want to build. First of all, it's totally an awesome idea. We were all like, yes, this is a moment we really need to be very bold. And coming from that statement, we're thinking, some of us coming from organizations that are still very much in the mainstream and that could feel very alienated by the kind of language that we have in our statements that really questions, capitalism and the whole mainstream. So how can we take that risk? We have to take that risk of being so bold in our organizations. But how the government...
10 more seconds.
Oh my God. So I will just move to the main idea was we want to make sure that the youth is at the forefront of this model, not our organizations, not like the old-fashioned organizations, but really the movements of the youth, taking the climate movement as a model, maybe have a great connection with the school strikes, the Fridays for Future, in the climate youth movement, and having the Global Student Forum as one of the major actors of.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Maria. Our next group is the Spanish, Espanol A through M. Who's reporting for that? the Spanish group.
Gabrielle, we can't hear Maria.
Maria Ron Balsera is trying to talk, and so far we're not hearing her.
Yeah, I think it's because she is still as an interpreter. Should I stop the interpretation?
Yes, stop the interpretation.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Sorry, I didn't even think of that.
That's fine. No worries. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Perfect.
Gracias.
Great, great. Okay, thank you. So it was a very small group, but we were talking about how to actually make these changes happen. And for that, we need to be quite aware of particularly some still a religious group, progressive religious group that are really vibrant in many communities, and they can help us make these changes. And also to work with the university, particularly with the students as well, with other civil society organizations. We didn't mention specific ones, but something very interesting was to also work with politicians, and to particularly with the government, and particularly with local governments, to make these changes happen. And part of the things that we should be doing as well is to work more closely with human rights, the treaties and human rights law, to how to also influence.
10 more seconds.
And yeah, so this is a great initiative, and everyone is very happy with it, and they want to be more involved. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, let's move then to English E through I. Who's going to report for that?
I think that's me. I was
Okay.
I was a bad host. I was not very good at designating roles or keeping to the time. But just to summarize very briefly, we had a lovely conversation with lots of people from vast and different spaces. And we talked about how TAP could be a space to bring together groups across different themes and topics. So we talked about farm worker education and issues of pesticides or gender-based violence, or looking at adult education and literacy and connecting groups who are working in South Africa with groups in Argentina, for example, around worker education, worker rights, and hosting joint meetings, but also connecting people so they could share stories and experiences together. I think also the idea of how paying attention all the time to how do we sustain these movements. Everybody's involved in lots of different movements, but sustaining them and keeping those connections alive over a long period of time is always a big challenge. So I think it's not, you know, the website is a great platform for it, having some discussions that bring people together.
10 more seconds.
Is a really useful thing, but we also have to think about how do we sustain as we build out and keep momentum going. So there's a real presence for the work we're doing and meaningfulness. So people feel they're coming away with really deep learning.
Thank you, Caroline. Our next group is the French, Français, A through M.
Hi, okay, I think that's us.
Merci.
So we discussed the radical view of TAP and how radical we can think and go. Like we were thinking of alternatives to schools and education systems, like democratic schools, which adopt a very different view on children and adults and their relationship. We discussed also non-violence towards children in general, and also individual responsibilities, because we were, some of us already within the TAP movement were saying that if their own behavior as teachers, for example, isn't really in alignment with the core values of TAP, then maybe it's not really relevant. So yeah, how individuals can be accountable for what they do within this movement, and
10 more seconds.
Yeah, and then how it will bring change somehow. Yeah, that's it.
Merci, Gabi. Let's move then to the English J through K. Apparently a lot of first names with those. Who
Yes,
is
that's us.
Kirsten?
Yes, yes. I'm calling in, so I don't have my camera on. But
Okay.
yeah, so we talked about we largely talked about student organizations and ways students can interact with local communities, as well as ways we can address as well as ways we can address institutional structures which enforce certain uh, ideologies, like the ones that you guys discuss in your mission statement. For instance, working to shift curriculum in ways that support marginalized identities, people of marginalized identities, as well as shifting institutional structures that support people of the community that are the communities that
10
are
more seconds, please.
surrounding universities. Yes. Yes, and also making sure that we are being aware of the communities that we impact while also working remotely.
Thank you very much. Let's move to the One Portuguese group who will be reporting on that.
Hi, it's me, Rui.
Please.
Yeah. We were also a small group, and we talk more about the ways we can promote the TAP and talk about other networks and other movements, that identify other movements that we can share the TAP manifesto, and in that way try to engage more people. And we also thought that this is a great initiative because we need a more global action, and we thought that TAP can allow us that. So, and briefly, it was this.
Thank you very much. Let's move then to one of our last English ones, the L through Q. Who can report on that?
So this is Michael. I'm just going to shout out one key message from the group. So we had a fascinating mix of a colleague who teaches in higher ed in South Korea, a colleague who works in the British Council, a colleague who works with OSF, and Langan, who is a PhD student at the University of Maryland with Steve, but who has worked in refugee education around the world. And so one of our takeaways was that all of us seek to be change agents in very different organizational settings on different aspects of education, and that we need to be in solidarity with each other to overcome the constraints inside our institutions and to champion what Langan eloquently called a commitment to interruption rather than reproduction. The idea of being a change agent wherever we are.
Perfect. And finally, our last group to report, the English R through S.
Share for that group. We had a great discussion on a lot of different topics, but it kind of boiled down to TAP needing to promote the struggles that people are in against kind of three major categories: market fundamentalism, neoliberalism, and moving away from education as a commodity. We thought it was really important to work with youth organizations, but especially youth organizations that are global in nature, and kind of the more kind of local aspects of things we talked about were working with voter rights organizations, youth groups, and then also what was mentioned was the recruitment of male youth educators. We thought that was really important.
Thank you, Rose.
Just add one more thing. Also, a colleague from Turkey made a really important point about saying, we really need to change, like if we just could move to learning by doing as sort of the curriculum and pedagogical approach, that would also just be very transformative. And so that could be something to promote.
Okay, we have approximately 15 minutes left in the scheduled time. And we had identified this as a time for people to add comments, perhaps that weren't emphasized in their group report or other points. You can do that either through the chat function, but if you would like to speak to the whole group, we also welcome that. I would try to recognize hands, but you could also just unmute yourself and talk, and somehow we'll make sure that people don't talk over each other. Once again, I am glad everybody was able to join. Sounds like some rich discussions. Moreover, it's a great start for activities of this new initiative. Anybody want to add any points or ask any questions, I suppose, could also be in order. You should all be able to unmute yourself if you want to speak.
I'll jump in whilst others are waiting. One of the things which came up in our group, which perhaps wasn't fed back because there was so little time, was that actually there's something very good about the bridge between academics and activists, between educators and activists, that's in the core of this. And as we rolled this out, it's really good to try to keep that convergence, that alliance between the sort of activists and the and actually, if you look at what's happening in many parts of the world, higher education has been detached from the education movement, and actually rebuilding that bridge with a proper vision of transformative education for all is a good idea.
I saw Michael wanted. Joel, why don't you go, and then Michael?
Joel Samoff, Stanford University. To follow that, it would help to hear a bit more from Mark, from the organizers and the presenters, about what you see as next steps. And that would, I think, offer some guidance to our thinking on how any or all of us might fit into the process.
I'll turn to Steve to start it, but others will join on it. A short answer to it is we're planning to have a meeting in a couple of weeks to really start to discuss in more detail next steps. Other than the only other thing that we have definitely planned is at the Comparative and International Education Society meeting that some of you attend. We have a session organized there, but there are other steps that we want to take, but we're hoping not only to be inspired by the suggestions from today, but also to involve more people in that conversation of next steps. Steve?
I'll just add, Joel, that this is still under discussion. We're talking about a series of webinars on alternative education possibilities. We're talking about linking with groups that are involved in social transformation and education issues. And how do we link with those groups? So we have space for organizational endorsements, but maybe cooperative work with some of these groups, jointly running webinars. When the pandemic ends, we talked about having workshops, maybe even the summer school. But these ideas are just all half-formed, and we welcome participation in organizing TAP, which I'll say at the end.
I think Salim wanted to weigh in.
No, it's quite all right. I really wanted Sia to talk about the very crucial points he made about social movements in struggle globally, particularly in the global south, that have played a very important role in promoting the kind of education and the viewpoint we've expressed in the statement, but I don't think there's time. Yes.
Maybe a webinar that draws out the ideas and from his life and speeches.
Let me just say, we would like this organization to be a truly global South, global North collaboration, and are very interested in having people join us who are interested in that, and in fostering existing social movements and connecting with them.
Michael?
Yeah, I just want to make a shout out here to a friend of mine who's joined the call, who's been quiet. His name is Scott Perry. He's a lifelong friend of mine. He was a primary school teacher in Los Angeles County for many decades. First grade teacher, a big bear of a white male, and worked mostly with Latino families. But he spent much of his career connecting the local school system with sustainable agriculture systems to bridge the gap between new thinking about food and nutrition and the farm to family connection with low-income families and their education to overcome the barriers between those two arenas of struggle and change. It's a fascinating example of what we're talking about in action. This idea of building systemic change process connections between, Scott worked very hard to make sure that the school system used organic, locally grown ingredients for school lunches as part of nutrition education for families that normally were not privy to that kind of privileged food, and at the same time supported local farms and drew them into a big market. This kind of contrarian thinking and all the struggles he went through to make that happen is a good example of what we're talking about. And Scott has very humbly been quiet during this call, but he's a good example of the kind of change agent we're looking for.
Thank you, Michael, and Scott, of course.
Thank you, Michael. In a short synopsis, I would say it is a joy to help farmers understand what brilliant educators they can be. And if you can help them find a comfortable space in a school setting, and then the parents, often Latino, can be their assistants while they're giving their presentation to students, you can form a family of educators, parents, and farmers. And it's an amazing combination. So that was perhaps obviously the fresh fruits and vegetables, and educating students about healthy eating is fundamentally important. But when you bring a family of the school members together around food, it's just a great process. So thank you, Michael.
We clearly had a very diverse set of participants for today's event, but we're hoping over time it becomes even more diverse, both in terms of geographic region, in terms of age, the type of issues that people focus on, and each of you that's still online and others can help by reaching out to people who you think may be inclined to support, at least in signing the statement, but really beyond that. There's a lot of exciting work that's going on. And we hope as part of TAP's functioning, and in fact, our website allows you to find a variety of other organizations that are or movements that are involved, and we're hoping to kind of multiply the effects of and connect people.
Amen. I think, Sangeeta is connecting with Scott about the Indian farmer movement related to what Scott has explored in LA County in and around the food production region, and a set of communities that are often isolated from rich agricultural and nutritional resources. This is the kind of connecting that I hope, the yeast that we hope to encourage the use of, these lateral connections and insights where, globally local activism and knowledge sharing can begin to occur.
I do, just jumping in again, I think that one of the things we do need to do is look at what are the existing education movements that we want to use as a way to disseminate both the statement and the sort of philosophy behind this. And I do think a lot of these movements exist in that consensual space, a consensual language, and this is more challenging and confrontational, but this is the moment to shift to that more confrontational tone, and to sort of, it's very easy for anybody to sign up to a statement which has got sort of very diluted, neutral language. This is bolder, and I think that's all the better for it. But there is also reaching out to the movements beyond education. So looking at all the different sectors of economic justice, social justice, and particularly climate justice, ecological justice, that proactively working with them so that they can incorporate education messaging into the way in which they're working. I think that that's a real contribution, which I think others are not doing enough of.
Notice that the statement is available in many more languages than we felt able to provide colleagues or comrades to do the interpretation today. And so if you have others who speak Arabic, Chinese, Hindi, Kiswahili, Korean, in addition to the languages we use for today's session, and we keep hoping to expand the number of languages that you can get access to the statement, and figure out ways to become a community across linguistic groups, which is obviously one of our challenges all of us face. Do others have any comments or questions? We're approaching the end of our 2-hour block. Somehow, as educators, we are used to having bells go off at the end of our class period, which maybe isn't a good way to think about education, for sure. But does anybody else have something? If not, I want to return the mic to Steve, who wanted to make some final concluding remarks. But first, anybody else?
Sandra, before you return the mic to me, Sandra in the chat signaled that feminist ideology should be a very important part of the framework and mission. And it is, Sandra. All of us are committed feminists and anti-racists, and think that feminist theory and practice offers a lot in terms of where we've been and where we are going. So agreed completely.
Steve, why don't you offer any concluding remarks that you want. We're just about at that time.
Sure. Gabrielle, you're going to share screen with our concluding slide. I don't really have any summary statements to say. I just want to thank you all for attending the launch of the Alternatives Project. Encourage you again to sign the statement if you haven't, and more than that, disseminate the statement. We're adding new languages. We're working on Japanese, German, Russian. So we'd like a very wide dissemination of the statement. And we really welcome you and any of your colleagues who want to get more involved. There's a Get More Involved button on the website, and write us about how you would like to get more involved. But we're very open to working with more people. This is not a closed shop by any means. And stay tuned. As we said, we'll be planning future webinars and other activities, and keep in touch with our website where they'll be listed. I encourage those of you who don't know the World Social Forum to check it out. It's going to be operating all this week through Saturday, I believe. And this is a great opportunity to interact with activists around the world, cross fields, cross country. It's going to be held in Mexico in 2022, but this is a chance to attend virtually. So I don't have anything else. Thank you again for attending, and it's great to see so many old friends and new ones. So thank you again, and hope to see you in the future.